For centuries, atheism built its entire foundation on a single assumption: that the universe had always existed, that there was no beginning, and therefore no need for a creator. Science, they promised, would eventually explain everything through natural processes alone, leaving no room for God. However, something went wrong with that plan. In the 20th century, modern physics and astronomy discovered something that shook the scientific world to its core. The universe had a beginning, and everything that has a beginning needs a cause. For most of human history, many scientists and philosophers assumed the universe was eternal. It had always been here, it would always be here, and there was no moment of creation to explain. This idea was convenient for those who wanted to argue against the existence of God, because an eternal universe needs no creator. However, in 1964, two radio astronomers named Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson accidentally discovered something that changed everything. While working at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, Penzias and Wilson detected a faint, persistent background radiation coming from every direction in the sky. They could not get rid of it. No matter where they pointed their equipment, the signal was there. What they had stumbled onto was the cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint echo of an enormous explosion that had given birth to the entire universe approximately 13.8 billion years ago. It was the observational confirmation of what became known as the Big Bang Theory. Arno Penzias won the Nobel Prize in Physics for this discovery in 1978. He later reflected on what the data meant, and his conclusion was striking. He said the findings matched what he would have expected if the biblical account of creation were true: a universe with a definite beginning, a moment before which nothing physical existed. This was not a theological statement from a preacher. It was a scientific reflection from one of the most decorated physicists of his generation. Cosmologist Alan Sandage, widely regarded as the father of modern observational cosmology, reached a similar conclusion after decades of research. He publicly affirmed that the evidence pointed toward a transcendent creator as the most reasonable explanation for the origin of the universe. Physicist Gerald Schroeder, who holds doctorates from MIT in both physics and earth sciences, made the same argument in his scientific writings. And the people drawing these conclusions were not outsiders to the field. They were among its most distinguished voices. The philosophical weight of all this is impossible to overstate. The cosmological argument, which has existed in philosophy for centuries, states that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and that cause, by definition, must exist outside of space, time, and matter, because space, time, and matter all came into existence at the Big Bang. Whatever caused it must transcend all three. That is precisely what every major monotheistic religion has been saying about God for thousands of years. The Big Bang established that the universe had a beginning, but the story does not stop there, and the conditions that emerge from that beginning are so precisely calibrated that physicists have spent decades wrestling with why, and the answers they keep arriving at are deeply uncomfortable for a purely materialist worldview. Physicists describe certain values as the fundamental constants of nature. These include the gravitational constant, the mass of the electron, the strength of the electromagnetic force, and the cosmological constant that governs the rate at which the universe expands. If any of these values were even slightly different, the universe as we know it could not exist. Change the gravitational constant by even a fraction, and stars cannot form. Alter the cosmological constant by a tiny amount, and the universe either collapses back in on itself or expands so rapidly that matter never clumps together enough to produce galaxies, stars, or planets. There is no life anywhere in either scenario. Physicist Luke Barnes, who has published peer-reviewed research specifically on the subject of fine-tuning, has described this as one of the most significant discoveries in modern cosmology. Paul Davies, a theoretical physicist and author who has spent his career studying the deep structure of the universe, acknowledged that the laws of physics appear to have been deliberately constructed to permit the existence of complex structures and ultimately life. Astrophysicist George Greenstein wrote honestly that the thought repeatedly arises that some supernatural agency must have been involved in the construction of the universe. These are not religious activists. These are scientists responding honestly to what the data is showing them. The most common atheist response to fine-tuning is the multiverse hypothesis. physics. The idea that if there are an infinite number of universes, each with different physical constants, it is statistically unsurprising that at least one would have the right conditions for life. However, the multiverse is not a scientific theory in the conventional sense. It cannot be tested, observed, or falsified by any known method. It is, by the standards of the scientific method itself, a speculative, philosophical position, and even accepting the multiverse still requires explaining the mechanism that generates all those universes, which simply pushes the fine-tuning problem back one level further without solving it. If the physics of the universe poses a serious challenge for atheism, what molecular biology discovered in the second half of the 20th century made things considerably more difficult. For much of scientific history, the living cell was imagined as a relatively simple chemical system. When Charles Darwin developed his theory of natural selection in 1859, he wrote honestly that to suppose the eye could have formed through natural selection seemed, in his own words, absurd in the highest degree. He went on to argue it was theoretically possible through gradual modification, but the admission revealed the scale of the problem his theory would have to overcome. Today, we know the cell is extraordinary in ways Darwin could not have imagined. Inside every living cell is a system of staggering complexity. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is the molecule that carries the genetic instructions for every living organism on Earth. Human DNA is organized into 46 chromosomes and contains approximately 3.2 billion base pairs of genetic information. This is not a vague chemical soup producing random reactions. It is a precisely organized digital code, functionally equivalent to the software that runs a computer, except that it is vastly more sophisticated than any software human engineers have ever written. Richard Dawkins, arguably the most prominent atheist alive today, has written with genuine astonishment about the complexity of the cell. He described being knocked sideways with wonder at what molecular biology has revealed. The machinery inside a single cell, including the molecular motors that move materials around, to the error correction systems that proofread genetic copying, the protein folding mechanisms that assemble three-dimensional structures from linear sequences, and the entire process that reads the DNA code and builds working proteins from it, all of this resembles precision engineering of the highest order. The question is whether engineering of that caliber can arise from blind, purposeless chemistry, or whether it requires exactly the kind of information-rich, goal-directed process we associate with intelligence. Theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss has pointed to snowflakes as evidence that nature builds complex, ordered structures without any intention. A snowflake does indeed form intricate patterns purely through the laws of chemistry and physics governing water molecules. However, there is a foundational difference between the ordered complexity of a snowflake and the specified complexity of DNA. A snowflake is complex but repetitive, built by the same simple rule applied over and over again. DNA carries specific instructions that accomplish particular biological tasks. The difference between the two is the same as the difference between a crystal and a written sentence. Both involve chemistry, but only one carries meaningful information that can be read, translated, and acted upon. To their credit, many atheist thinkers have recognized that the evidence demands serious explanation and have not simply dismissed it. However, the explanations they have proposed reveal something significant about the intellectual burden they are trying to carry. Some have proposed that life on Earth was seeded by an alien civilization, an idea known as directed panspermia that was advanced by Francis Crick, one of the scientists who co-discovered the structure of DNA. The logic behind the proposal was telling. Crick acknowledged that life appearing spontaneously on Earth seemed statistically implausible, so perhaps it was placed here by intelligent beings from another world. However, this does not solve the problem of the origin of life. It relocates it to another planet and leaves the exact same questions unanswered there. Stephen Hawking famously proposed that the laws of physics themselves could explain how the universe arose from nothing through a process called quantum tunneling. However, the mathematical framework Hawking used already assumes the existence of physical laws and quantum fields. Using the rules of physics to explain the origin of physics is a circular argument. You cannot use the game to explain where the game itself came from. Richard Dawkins has argued that however improbable life looks, any naturalistic explanation is more satisfying than invoking God, because God would would require his own explanation. However, this argument contains a flaw that philosophers have identified for centuries. Not everything that explains something needs to be explained by something else. The entire concept of a first cause, an uncaused cause that begins the chain of existence, is precisely the idea of a being who exists necessarily rather than contingently. Demanding that God have a prior explanation is similar to demanding that logic itself have a logical justification. Some things must exist as foundational realities, or explanation never gets started at all. There is one more piece of evidence that does not come from physics or biology, but from something much closer to home. It comes from the fact that you care about justice. You care whether things are fair. When you see an innocent person suffer, something inside you recognizes it as genuinely wrong, not wrong as a matter of personal preference, the way someone might prefer one type of food over another, but wrong in a deep and binding sense that does not change with culture or convenience. Richard Dawkins himself, in his book The Selfish Gene, wrote that the universe has precisely no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind and pitiless indifference. This was his attempt to describe honestly what a purely material universe actually contains. And yet Dawkins also argues with great passion against cruelty, condemns the abuse of children, and speaks out forcefully against religious violence. He behaves consistently as though morality is real, binding, and matters deeply. But if the universe truly contains no good and no evil, the question becomes, on what foundation does he make those judgments? From a purely biological standpoint, human moral intuitions evolved because cooperation and fairness helped our ancestors survive and build societies. This is a reasonable description of how moral feelings developed. However, it does not explain why those moral feelings are actually true rather than merely useful. Evolution could theoretically have produced beings who feel strongly that cruelty is wonderful and compassion is weakness if those traits had happened to aid survival. The fact that human moral intuitions across vastly different cultures consistently point toward justice, protection of the innocent, honesty, and genuine care for others requires an explanation that goes beyond what survival alone can provide. The alternative explanation is that moral truths exist because they are grounded in the character of a being who is genuinely and objectively good. That is the theistic account of morality, and it provides a foundation for moral truth in a way that pure materialism has consistently struggled to do. None of what we have covered today is meant to pressure you toward any particular conclusion. These are real questions, and they deserve honest and careful engagement. However, the evidence from the beginning of the universe, the precise fine-tuning of physical constants, the information complexity of DNA, the inadequacy of the alternative explanations proposed, and the reality of moral truth that binds human beings across every culture and century, all of it points in the same direction. It points toward a universe that was not an accident and toward a creator of enormous intelligence and purpose. The scientist who co-discovered the cosmic microwave background radiation and won the Nobel Prize for it said the findings matched what he would expect from the biblical account of creation. The physicists who study fine-tuning describe the universe as appearing deliberately constructed for life, where the biologists who study the cell describe machinery of breathtaking sophistication that resembles purposeful engineering, and the moral intuitions that every human being carries, regardless of where they were born or what they were taught, point toward a standard of goodness that exists independently of human preference or evolutionary pressure. Atheism promised that science would close the door on God permanently. Instead, every major discovery of the last 100 years has made that door considerably harder to close. Subscribe for more